Dust choked the auction block as a terrified young woman clutched her infant brother tightly against her chest. Sold for a mere handful of dollars to settle a gambling debt, Clara awaited a brutal, unimaginable fate. But stepping from the cold shadows of the Colorado pines came a towering mountain man covered in thick furs and battle scars. He didn't come to conquer, but to claim them, uttering words that would alter their destiny forever. Welcome to a tale of survival, betrayal, and untamed love. Despair hung heavy in the frigid November air of Oakhaven, a miserable logging outpost nestled at the foothills of the unforgiving San Juan Mountains. Clara Miller stood trembling on a makeshift wooden platform constructed from rough-hewn pine boards, her arms aching as she cradled her 6-month-old brother, Toby. The baby whimpered, his small face red from the biting wind, while Clara tried desperately to shield him with the frayed edges of her worn woolen shawl. Mud covered the hem of her faded calico dress, and her boots were entirely soaked through. Yet the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the agonizing terror twisting inside her chest. Gideon Rutledge, her late mother's second husband, stood beside her, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and chewing tobacco. He was a man hollowed out by greed and gambling, possessing a soul as black as the coal dug from the nearby mines. Having lost his final claim and every cent to his name at a faro table the night before, Gideon had dragged Clara and Toby to the center of the settlement. There was no law in Oakhaven in the winter of 1874, only the harsh dictates of men with guns and gold. Gideon intended to auction his stepdaughter off to the highest bidder to satisfy his debts to Bartholomew Jenkins, the ruthless proprietor of the local saloon, who watched the spectacle with a greedy, gold-toothed grin from the porch of his establishment. Men gathered around the platform like vultures circling a dying calf. They were rough, unwashed prospectors, hardened trappers, and outlaws seeking refuge from the lawmen back east. Clara kept her eyes downcast, tears freezing on her pale cheeks. She tightened her grip on Toby, silently praying for a miracle, or at the very least, a swift end. "What am I offered for the girl?" Gideon bellowed, his voice cracking with desperate enthusiasm. "Strong, young, knows how to cook and clean. And she comes with the brat, though you can leave him out in the snow for all I care." Laughter erupted from the crowd, a cruel, jagged sound that made Clara flinch. Bartholomew Jenkins took a drag from his cigar and stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "I'll give you $50, Gideon. She'll do fine scrubbing the saloon floors, and maybe warming a bed or two when the winter gets deep." $50, Gideon shouted, his eyes wide with frantic greed. "I hear 50. Do I hear 60? A grizzled miner with a scarred cheek spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. 60? But I ain't feedin' no baby." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her lips against Toby's soft, cold forehead. She knew she had to run, but where? The wilderness would freeze them in hours, and these men would hunt her down like a rabbit. The bidding war escalated, voices overlapping in a sickening cacophony of ownership and degradation. $70. 80. Bartholomew Jenkins raised his hand, looking to end the contest. $100. Final offer, Gideon. Hand her over. Gideon's face flushed with triumph. He reached out, his rough, dirty fingers wrapping around Clara's arm to drag her down the steps toward the saloon owner. Clara let out a panicked sob, jerking backward, trying to protect Toby from the sudden violence of his grip. "Hold on," a voice rumbled. It was not a loud shout, but the sheer, gravelly depth of the tone cut through the freezing wind and the murmur of the crowd like a heavy steel blade. The men parted, their murmurs dying in their throats. Stepping out from the shadows of the livery stable was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the granite peaks of the mountains. He was staggeringly tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in a thick, grizzly bear hide coat that made him appear twice the size of any man in Oakhaven. A wide-brimmed hat cast a dark shadow over his face, but beneath it, piercing ice-blue eyes scanned the platform. A thick, untrimmed dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and a massive hunting knife rested at his hip, accompanied by a long-barreled Colt revolver. This was Wyatt Mercer, a solitary mountain man whose reputation was wrapped in violent rumors and whispered legends. Folks said he lived higher up the peaks than any sane man would dare, trading pelts only twice a year and speaking to no one. Wyatt walked slowly toward the platform, his heavy leather boots sinking into the mud. The silence in the square became absolute. Even Bartholomew Jenkins took a hesitant step back, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "I said, 'Hold on,'" Wyatt repeated, his eyes fixing squarely on Gideon Rutledge's trembling hand, which was still clamped around Clara's arm. "Let go of the girl." Gideon swallowed hard, his false bravado faltering. "Now see here, Mercer. This is a lawful transaction. Jenkins here just bid $100. Wyatt didn't argue. He reached into the deep pocket of his fur coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. With a flick of his thick wrist, he tossed it through the air. The pouch landed squarely against Gideon's chest with a heavy, metallic clink. Gideon scrambled to catch it, nearly dropping it into the mud. He fumbled with the leather drawstrings, his eyes going wide as he peered inside. "There's $200 in minted gold eagles in that bag," Wyatt said, his voice flat, completely devoid of emotion. "The girl and the child are mine." Bartholomew Jenkins bristled, his pride wounded. "Now wait just a minute, Mercer. You don't come down from your mountain and just—" Wyatt shifted his gaze to the saloon owner. It was a dead, hollow look, promising immediate and catastrophic violence if Jenkins uttered another syllable. The saloon owner closed his mouth, took a step back, and tipped his hat in nervous surrender. Clara stood frozen on the platform, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. She had been saved from the saloon, but at what cost? She looked down at the massive, wild-looking man standing at the base of the stairs. Wyatt Mercer extended a large, calloused hand toward her. It was scarred, rough as bark, and steady. "Come down," Wyatt instructed softly. It wasn't a request, it was a command, yet laced with a strange, quiet calm. Clara, clutching her baby brother, took a trembling breath and placed her small, pale hand into the giant's grasp, stepping down from the auction block and directly into the terrifying unknown. Leaving the wretched confines of Oakhaven behind them, Clara found herself following the massive silhouette of Wyatt Mercer up a winding, treacherous mountain trail. The settlement quickly vanished beneath a dense canopy of blue spruce and ponderosa pines, swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Wyatt walked ahead, leading a sturdy, muscular pack mule laden with supplies, while Clara rode upon a massive black draft horse. The beast was gentle, despite its intimidating size, carefully navigating the loose rocks and icy patches of the steep incline. For the first 2 hours, the silence between them was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves on frozen earth and the occasional gust of wind howling through the deep canyons. Clara sat rigidly in the saddle, clutching Toby to her chest beneath the thick, woolen blanket Wyatt had tossed over her shoulders before they left town. Her mind raced with 1,000 terrifying possibilities. What did this giant want with her? Why would a solitary trapper pay a small fortune in gold for a desperate woman and a crying infant? The stories she had overheard in Oakhaven painted the mountain men as feral savages, driven mad by isolation and the brutal cold. She constantly scanned the treacherous path, calculating her odds of slipping off the horse and running away, but the sheer cliffs dropping off to their left and the impenetrable forest to their right rendered any escape attempt suicidal. As they climbed higher into the San Juan range, the temperature plummeted drastically. The sky above bruised into a deep, heavy purple, and the first sparse flakes of snow began to drift down from the swollen clouds. Toby began to fuss, his small cries echoing sharply in the thin mountain air. Clara tried to bounce him gently in her arms, whispering soothing words, but the baby was hungry and deeply unsettled by the biting cold. Wyatt stopped the mule abruptly. He turned slowly, his massive frame intimidating as he walked back toward Clara's horse. Clara instinctively shrank back in the saddle, bracing herself for anger or violence. Instead, Wyatt reached into a saddlebag, strapped to his horse, and pulled out a leather canteen and a small tin wrapped in cloth. "Drink," Wyatt commanded quietly, handing her the canteen. "It's warmed goat's milk. Mixed it with a little honey back down at the trading post before I found you. The babe needs it." Clara stared at him, her wide brown eyes filled with shock. Her trembling fingers took the canteen. It was surprisingly warm. She uncorked it and carefully held it to Toby's lips. The hungry infant eagerly began to drink, his cries immediately ceasing. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She looked down at Wyatt, who was now untying the cloth to reveal a stack of thick, heavily buttered oat biscuits. "Eat," he said, offering them up to her. "You're shivering so hard the horse is getting spooked. We have another hour of climbing before we reach the timberline. The storm is going to break soon." "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had spoken since the auction block. Wyatt grunted, his expression unreadable beneath the thick beard. He turned on his heel and marched back to the mule, grabbing the lead rope and continuing the grueling march upward. The storm did break. Within 30 minutes, the gentle snowfall turned into a blinding, horizontal whiteout. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing through the pines and whipping snow violently into Clara's face. She leaned forward over the saddle, using her own body as a shield to protect Toby from the freezing assault. She could barely see Wyatt, just a dark, imposing shadow moving relentlessly forward through the blizzard. Fear gripped her heart tightly. If they lost the trail, they would freeze to death in a matter of hours. Suddenly, the horse slipped on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. The massive beast whinnied in panic, its back legs sliding dangerously close to the steep, rocky drop-off of the canyon edge. Clara screamed, clutching Toby, preparing for the fatal plunge. Before the horse could go over, Wyatt lunged through the blinding snow. He threw his massive weight against the horse's flank, his boots digging deeply into the frozen mud as he hauled violently on the reins. With a surge of raw, terrifying strength, he dragged the draft horse back onto solid ground, holding the beast steady until its hooves found purchase. Wyatt stood there, chest heaving, his face covered in snow and ice, his large hand resting firmly on Clara's trembling knee. "I got you," he shouted over the roaring wind. "I won't let you fall. We're almost there." True to his word, the dense trees suddenly parted, revealing a small, flat plateau nestled against the sheer rock face of the mountain. In the center sat a sturdy, well-built log cabin. Thick smoke was already curling from the stone chimney, a testament to Wyatt having banked a slow fire before his journey into town. Wyatt helped Clara down from the horse, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he guided her quickly through the heavy oak door and into the cabin. The interior was completely unlike the savage hovel Clara had imagined. It was warm, impeccably clean, and smelled of wood smoke, dried sage, and pine. Thick bearskin rugs covered the plank floors, and a massive stone hearth dominated the far wall, where red embers glowed invitingly. Books were stacked neatly on wooden shelves, and heavy cast-iron pots hung in an orderly fashion in the kitchen corner. Clara stood near the doorway, shivering violently, clutching Toby as she watched Wyatt secure the door against the storm. He took off his snow-covered hat and heavy grizzly coat, revealing a man who, though hardened and scarred, possessed a profound, quiet strength in his weathered face. He walked over to the hearth, tossing a large log onto the embers, and sparks danced wildly in the dim light. He turned to look at Clara, standing terrified and freezing in his home. He walked toward a heavy wooden chest, pulling out a thick, beautifully crafted quilt, and draped it carefully over her and the baby. "Sit by the fire, Clara," Wyatt said, his voice shedding its rough edge, becoming soft, almost vulnerable. "You don't need to be afraid of me. I didn't buy you to be a servant or a slave." He looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, a deep, unspoken sorrow flickering in his ice-blue eyes. "I've been alone on this mountain for a long, long time. The winter is too cold for a man to face with just his own ghosts." He gently brushed a snowflake from Toby's blanket. "You're both my family now. This is your home." Snow relentlessly battered the sturdy log walls of the cabin for 3 unyielding days, locking Clara and her baby brother inside a frozen, isolated world with the giant they knew only as Wyatt Mercer. The paralyzing fear that had gripped Clara during their harrowing ascent slowly morphed into a cautious, bewildered curiosity. Wyatt did not act like the feral, dangerous mountain men whispered about in the saloons of Oakhaven. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that belied his massive size, stepping softly across the floorboards so as not to wake sleeping Toby. Routine became their silent language. Before the sun even thought to breach the jagged mountain peaks, Wyatt was awake. He would stoke the dying embers in the massive stone hearth, fetching fresh water from a deep, covered barrel in the corner, and prepare a hearty breakfast of cured venison, cornmeal mush, and strong, chicory-laced coffee. He demanded nothing of Clara, forcing her only to eat and rest. When Toby cried, Wyatt did not grow angry. Instead, he would often carve small pieces of soft pine by the fire, letting the rhythmic scraping of his heavy hunting knife soothe the infant. On the fourth afternoon, the blizzard finally broke, giving way to a piercing, blindingly bright winter sun reflecting off the pristine snowdrifts. Wyatt had gone outside to clear the heavy accumulation from the roof and tend to the draft horse and mule in the adjoining lean-to. Clara took the opportunity to sweep the cabin floors, needing to feel useful, to earn the sanctuary she had been so freely given. As she moved a heavy bearskin rug near Wyatt's sleeping cot, her broom knocked against a loose floorboard. The heavy thud caused the wood to shift, revealing a small, hollowed-out space beneath. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knelt down, her trembling fingers reaching into the dusty cavity. She withdrew a small, intricately carved wooden music box and a faded, silver daguerreotype encased in leather. Unable to stop herself, Clara opened the clasp of the photograph. Staring back at her was a beautiful, severe-looking woman in a high-collared dress, holding a small boy who possessed Wyatt's identical, striking ice-blue eyes. Clara traced the edge of the metal plate, a profound sadness washing over her. Her name was Abigail, Clara gasped, dropping the broom as she spun around. Wyatt stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the harsh winter light. Snow clung to his thick beard, and his eyes were fixed on the photograph in her hands. Clara braced herself for his fury, clutching the image to her chest like a shield. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Mercer," Clara stammered, stepping backward. "I didn't mean to pry. I was just sweeping, and the board—" Wyatt closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the biting cold. He didn't look angry. He looked devastatingly tired. He slowly walked over to her, his heavy boots thudding against the planks, and gently took the photograph from her trembling hands. "My wife," Wyatt murmured, his gravelly voice thick with an emotion he was struggling to suppress. "And my son, Samuel." They passed in the winter of '68. Cholera swept through our settlement down in the valley like a scythe. I was away hunting. By the time I returned, the ground was already frozen too hard to dig proper graves. Clara's heart shattered at the raw agony vibrating in his words. The terrifying giant of Oakhaven was just a man broken by unimaginable grief. "I came up this mountain to die, Clara," Wyatt confessed, staring into the flickering flames of the hearth. "I built this cabin to be my tomb, but the mountain wouldn't take me. It just made me harder, colder. When I saw you on that auction block, holding that baby, shielding him from the wind, I saw Samuel. I saw Abigail. I couldn't let the darkness take you, too." He turned his piercing blue eyes toward her. The harshness completely melted away. "I bought your freedom because I needed to save something good in this miserable world. You owe me nothing, Clara. When the spring thaw comes, I will give you enough gold to secure passage on the Denver and Rio Grande Railway. You can go anywhere you want." Tears spilled over Clara's lashes, tracking hot and fast down her pale cheeks. She took a step toward him, closing the vast distance between them. Before she could articulate the overwhelming swell of gratitude and complicated emotions blooming in her chest, a sound sliced through the quiet intimacy of the cabin. It was a howl, long, jagged, and terrifyingly close. Wyatt's demeanor shifted instantly. The grieving father vanished, replaced by the lethal, hardened mountain man. He snatched his long-barreled Colt revolver from the table and pulled his heavy rifle from the mantel. "Timberwolves," Wyatt snarled, his eyes narrowing. "The storm starved them out. They smell the mule." A cacophony of frantic whinnies and the violent kicking of heavy hooves echoed from the lean-to attached to the back of the cabin. The wolves were trying to breach the wooden slats. "Stay here," Wyatt commanded, throwing his grisly coat over his shoulders. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for anything other than my voice." Wyatt threw open the door and plunged into the blinding, freezing white, leaving Clara alone in the sudden, terrifying silence, the heavy wooden bar dropping into place with a definitive, hollow thud. Blood painted the pristine snowdrifts in horrifying, crimson streaks. The wind howled a vicious tune as Wyatt Mercer threw himself into the chaotic fray inside the lean-to. 5 massive, starving timber wolves had breached the weakened rear slats of the enclosure, their yellow eyes glowing with feral desperation. The heavy draft horse was rearing on its hind legs, kicking violently in a tight circle, while the terrified mule brayed in the corner, bleeding from a deep slash across its flank. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He raised the heavy rifle, the deafening crack of the gunshot echoing off the canyon walls as the lead wolf, a massive beast the size of a mountain lion, was thrown backward. The acrid smell of black powder filled the freezing air. Before Wyatt could chamber another round, 2 wolves lunged at him from the shadows. He dropped the rifle, drawing his Colt revolver and firing point blank into the chest of the beast soaring toward his throat. The wolf crumpled, but the third beast sank its razor-sharp teeth deeply into Wyatt's left thigh. Agony, hot and blinding, ripped through his leg. Wyatt roared, a sound more animal than human, and drove the heavy steel barrel of his revolver into the wolf's skull. The beast let go, whimpering, before scrambling out through the broken slats, followed quickly by the remaining, cowardly members of the pack. Wyatt leaned heavily against the wooden support beam, his breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps. He looked down. Blood was pumping steadily from the jagged tear in his heavy canvas trousers, pooling darkly on the ice. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping numbness. He had to get inside. Inside the cabin, Clara was trembling violently, her back pressed flush against the barred door. Toby was screaming in his makeshift crib, terrified by the gunfire. When the heavy, rhythmic pounding finally hit the thick oak wood, Clara jumped. "Clara!" Wyatt's voice was strained, breathless. "Open the door!" She hoisted the heavy wooden bar with a frantic surge of adrenaline. Wyatt collapsed inward, his massive frame crashing onto the floorboards. Clara screamed, dropping to her knees as she saw the gruesome amount of blood soaking his leg. "Lock it!" Wyatt grunted, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. Clara scrambled to bar the door before rushing back to his side. She was no stranger to terrible wounds. Her mother had perished from a slow, agonizing illness, and Gideon had often come home bloodied from saloon brawls. But this was different. If Wyatt died, she and Toby would freeze or starve within a week. "I need to stop the bleeding," Clara said, her voice shaking but her hands remarkably steady. She grabbed Wyatt's hunting knife from his belt and quickly sliced open the blood-soaked canvas of his trousers. The bite was deep, the flesh torn savagely. "Fire," Wyatt wheezed, his eyes rolling back slightly. "Need to cauterize it, the poker." Clara's stomach violently revolted, but she nodded. She rushed to the hearth, burying the heavy iron fireplace poker deep into the hottest, glowing red coals. She filled a basin with snowmelt, grabbed clean rags, and dashed back to him. "Bite down on this," Clara instructed, rolling up a piece of thick leather and placing it between his teeth. Wyatt nodded, his ice-blue eyes locking onto hers, trusting her completely. Clara pulled the glowing, white-hot iron from the fire. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she pressed the searing metal firmly against the shredded flesh of his thigh. Wyatt's back arched violently off the floor, a muffled, guttural scream vibrating through the leather in his mouth. The sickening smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, but the rapid flow of blood instantly stopped, sealed by the brutal heat. Wyatt slumped backward, unconscious, the pain finally dragging him into the dark. For the next 2 days, Wyatt burned with a terrifying, consuming fever. Clara rarely slept, endlessly alternating cold, wet cloths upon his forehead and forcing drops of willow bark tea past his chapped lips. In his delirium, the giant murmured fragmented, horrifying secrets. He spoke of the panic of '73, of starving miners cheated out of their claims by a ruthless railroad syndicate. But mostly, he muttered about the gold, the heavy pouches of minted coins he had used to buy Clara. While searching his coat pockets for more willow bark, Clara discovered a heavy, leather-bound journal. The pages detailed a daring train robbery engineered by Wyatt. The gold he possessed wasn't panned from a river? It was stolen payroll meant for the syndicate executives, which Wyatt had been methodically distributing to the destitute families in the valley below. Wyatt Mercer was not just a grieving widower. He was a wanted outlaw, a Robin Hood of the San Juan Mountains, hunted by ruthless men. Down in the muddy, thawing streets of Oakhaven, the threat was already mobilizing. Gideon Rutledge sat in the dimly lit corner of Bartholomew Jenkins's saloon, counting his gold coins for the 100th time. Across from him sat Jebediah Cross, a notorious bounty hunter with a reputation for skinning his bounties alive. Jebediah was staring intently at one of the gold eagles, tracing a specific, distinctive scratch across the eagle's wing. "This gold belongs to the Union Pacific Syndicate," Jebediah hissed, his dark eyes gleaming with malicious realization. "The railroad is offering a $5,000 reward for the man who robbed that train." "You say a giant in a bear coat gave you this?" "Yeah," Gideon grinned, his rotting teeth showing. "Took my stepdaughter up the mountain." "I can show you the trail." Jebediah stood up, a wicked, jagged smile spreading across his scarred face. "Saddle the horses, Gideon. We're going hunting." Back on the mountain, Wyatt's eyes finally fluttered open, the fever having broken during the night. He looked up to find Clara asleep in a chair beside him, her hand resting protectively over his chest. He was alive, but as the winter winds howled outside the cabin, Wyatt knew with absolute, chilling certainty that the blood on the snow would inevitably draw the wolves that walked on two legs. Sunlight, brilliant and unforgiving, poured through the frosted glass of the single cabin window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the warm air. Wyatt Mercer slowly pushed himself upright, groaning as a fresh wave of fiery pain radiated from his bandaged thigh. 3 days had passed since the wolf attack, and though the fever had broken, the physical toll of the brutal injury left the giant of a man uncharacteristically weakened. He watched Clara from the bed as she hummed a soft, mournful hymn, rocking Toby near the hearth. Her dark hair had escaped its neat braid, cascading down her back, and her pale face was etched with a profound, weary strength that Wyatt found utterly mesmerizing. She turned, catching his ice-blue gaze. Setting the sleeping infant into a carved wooden cradle Wyatt had made years ago for a son who never grew to use it, she walked over to the bedside. Without a word, she handed him a tin cup filled with bitter willow bark tea. Wyatt took it, his large, calloused fingers deliberately brushing against her soft, trembling hand. "You found the journal," Wyatt stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. He had seen it resting on the wooden table, moved from the deep pocket of his coat. Clara nodded, her brown eyes meeting his without flinching. "I did. I was looking for more medicine when the fever took you. I read enough to understand that the gold you used to buy me wasn't panned from the river. You stole it from the Union Pacific Syndicate." Wyatt let out a long, heavy sigh, resting his head back against the rough-hewn log wall. In the spring of '73, the silver veins down in Silverton dried up, and the panic hit the valleys hard. The railroad syndicate, run by a ruthless baron named Nathaniel Reed, bought up all the land deeds from starving miners for pennies on the dollar. Men who refused to sell found their camps burned to the ground. Children were dying of malnutrition right in the streets, Clara. I couldn't just sit on this mountain and watch my neighbors perish while Reed's payroll trains rolled through the canyons overflowing with minted eagles. He leaned forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his leg. I didn't steal that gold for myself. I gave it to the local parish in Durango to buy flour, medicine, and blankets for the displaced families. But Nathaniel Reed is a man who measures his pride in blood. He hired Pinkertons to hunt me down, and when they failed, he put a $5,000 bounty on my head. Clara processed this revelation in silence. The terrifying brute she had met on the auction block in Oakhaven was, in reality, a man whose heart was too large, too fiercely protective for the brutal world he inhabited. A profound, undeniable affection began to take root deep within her chest, replacing the fear that had dictated her life for so long. "Gideon saw the gold," Clara whispered, the chilling realization suddenly freezing the blood in her veins. "When you threw the pouch at the auction, He used to gamble with a man who worked the rail lines. Gideon knows what those minted eagles look like. Wyatt's expression hardened instantly. The tender vulnerability vanished, replaced by the lethal, calculating instincts of a hunted outlaw. If Gideon recognized the gold, he didn't keep his mouth shut. There are men in Oakhaven who would slaughter their own mothers for a fraction of that bounty. Pushing through the agonizing pain, Wyatt threw his legs over the side of the bed. Clara rushed forward to stop him, pressing her hands against his broad chest. "You cannot walk, Wyatt. The wound will tear open again. If we stay blind in this cabin, we will die," Wyatt commanded softly, gently but firmly removing her hands from his chest. "Grab the Winchester rifle from the mantel. I am going to teach you how to load and fire it." For the next several hours, the cabin transformed from a sanctuary into an armory. Wyatt limped heavily around the room, barricading the heavy oak door with thick iron brackets he pulled from the floorboards. He shuttered the glass window with solid wood, leaving only a narrow slit for the rifle barrel. Clara sat at the heavy dining table, her hands trembling as she practiced shoving heavy brass cartridges into the side-loading gate of the Winchester repeater. Her fingers were bruised and aching, but she refused to stop. She was no longer a helpless girl waiting to be sold. She was fighting for her brother, and for the man who had risked everything to save them both. As dusk began to settle over the jagged peaks, painting the snowdrifts in deep shades of violet and gray, the unnatural silence of the mountain was broken by the sharp, echoing snap of a dry pine branch breaking. It wasn't the heavy, muffled tread of a wolf. It was the distinct, deliberate sound of a horse's hoof striking buried rock. Wyatt immediately extinguished the kerosene lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The only light came from the dying, red embers in the hearth. He grabbed his long-barreled Colt revolver, checking the cylinder by touch, and limped toward the window slit. "Stay low," Wyatt whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "Keep Toby behind the heavy iron stove. If they breach the door, Clara, do not hesitate. You aim for the center of the chest and you pull the trigger until the rifle is empty." Outside, the wind whipped through the pines, carrying with it a chilling, mocking voice that Wyatt instantly recognized. It was a voice that belonged to nightmares. "Wyatt Mercer?" the voice echoed through the canyon, dripping with sadistic glee. "I know you're in there, you bleeding giant. It's Jebediah Cross, and I've come to collect Mr. Reed's gold." Silence stretched agonizingly over the snow-covered plateau, wrapping the fortified cabin in a suffocating shroud. The only sounds to penetrate the heavy dread were the shrieking wind battering the timberline and Toby's soft, fearful whimpers echoing from his cradle, safely tucked behind the massive cast-iron stove. Clara crouched low to the rough floorboards, her heart hammering violently against her ribs like a trapped bird desperately seeking an escape. The heavy Winchester rifle felt icy and awkward in her trembling hands, its polished wood and cold brass a stark contrast to the domestic life she had always known. Yet she gripped it with desperate, unwavering resolve. Across the dim, heavily shadowed cabin, Wyatt stood flattened against the wall beside the shuttered window. His Colt revolver was raised and ready, but his face was deathly pale. His injured leg throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic heat, threatening to buckle beneath his massive frame at any given moment. Jebediah Cross was not a man who bluffed. Known throughout the desolate stretches of the Colorado Territory for collecting bounties without the cumbersome burden of bringing his targets back alive, Cross was an apex predator who took a perverse joy in playing with his prey. "Wyatt Mercer?" The bounty hunter's voice echoed through the jagged canyon, dripping with a sadistic glee that chilled Clara to her very marrow. "I know you're in there, you bleeding giant. It's Jebediah Cross, and I've come to collect Mr. Reed's gold." Wyatt didn't dignify the taunt with a response. He peered cautiously through the narrow slit he had left in the window shutter, his sharp, calculating eyes scanning the deep violet shadows of the dense tree line. "I brought a friend of yours, Mercer?" Jebediah hollered, his voice carrying easily over the howling wind. "A pathetic, sniveling little rat named Gideon said you stole his property from the Oakhaven auction block. Now, I don't give a damn about the girl or the baby. Send the girl out with the rest of the syndicate's gold, and I might just let you freeze to death peacefully." Through the narrow gap, Wyatt spotted the unmistakable glint of moonlight reflecting off a rifle barrel just seconds before the cabin violently erupted in deafening noise. A volley of heavy lead tore mercilessly through the front of the cabin. Bullets splintered the thick pine logs, sending jagged shards of wood flying through the air like deadly shrapnel. One round shattered the clay pitcher resting on the dining table, raining freezing water and sharp ceramic fragments across Clara's back. She screamed, pressing herself flatter against the floor, covering her head as destruction rained down around her. "Hold your fire, Clara!" Wyatt roared over the deafening cracks of gunfire, his voice a grounding anchor in the chaos. "They're just trying to draw our position." Outside, hidden behind a massive, snow-capped boulder, Gideon Rutledge was hyperventilating. He had foolishly believed they would simply march up the mountain, demand the stolen gold, and leave with their pockets lined. He had never bargained for a bloody, terrifying siege against a legendary mountain man. "He ain't surrendering, Cross!" Gideon panicked, his eyes wide with utter cowardice as he watched bullets chew through the cabin walls. "He's gonna kill us both! I'm leaving!" Gideon scrambled backward, turning his back to the cabin to run down the treacherous, icy trail. Jebediah Cross didn't even blink. Without uttering a single word of warning, the bounty hunter smoothly pivoted, leveled his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle, and shot Gideon square in the center of his back. The horrific boom echoed off the jagged peaks as Gideon pitched forward into a deep snowdrift, dead before he even realized his fragile alliance had been lethally broken. "Looks like your stepdaddy just had a sudden change of heart, little girl," Jebediah cackled, the sound echoing manically through the dark pines. "Now it's just you, me, and the giant." Jebediah began to move, utilizing the thick trunks of the ponderosa pines as cover as he systematically advanced toward the cabin porch. He laid down a punishing, suppressing fire that forced Wyatt to remain pinned defensively against the wall. The bounty hunter was terrifyingly fast, and Wyatt's injured leg made it entirely impossible for him to maneuver for a clean, retaliatory shot. Suddenly, a heavy glass bottle filled to the brim with kerosene came crashing through the remaining panes of the high window, landing directly on the wooden floorboards near the center of the room. A second later, a lit match followed its trajectory. The fuel ignited instantly. A ferocious wall of orange flame roared toward the ceiling, threatening to consume the dry logs of the cabin and roast them all alive. "The fire!" Wyatt yelled, choking on the sudden bloom of thick, acrid black smoke. He lunged away from the safety of the wall to smother the flames with a heavy bearskin rug, but his wounded leg buckled violently underneath him. He hit the floor hard, his grip faltering as his heavy Colt revolver skittered out of reach. In that split second of total vulnerability, the heavy oak door shuddered violently. Jebediah Cross had reached the porch. The bounty hunter kicked the door with devastating, brutal force. The iron brackets Wyatt had painstakingly installed groaned under the pressure, the thick wood splintering inward. Another brutal kick followed, and the door burst completely open, a wild swirl of freezing snow and bitter gun smoke violently rushing into the burning cabin. Jebediah stood framed in the ruined doorway, a towering specter in a long, snow-dusted duster coat, a wicked grin splitting his scarred face. He raised his twin revolvers, aiming directly at Wyatt, who was struggling desperately to reach his dropped gun on the floorboards. "End of the line, mountain man," Jebediah sneered, his fingers tightening confidently on the triggers. Clara rose from the dark shadows behind the iron stove. The paralyzing fear that had defined her entire existence evaporated, burned away by a fierce, protective maternal rage and an all-consuming love for the wounded man struggling on the floor. She leveled the heavy Winchester rifle, resting the cold steel barrel against the iron stovepipe to steady her violently shaking arms. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't hesitate. She aimed for the center of Jebediah's chest, executing the exact motion Wyatt had taught her hours before. She pulled the trigger. The heavy rifle kicked back violently, bruising her shoulder, but the thunderous blast was immediate and devastating. The brass cartridge ejected, spinning in the smoky air as the high-caliber bullet struck Jebediah Cross with the unstoppable force of a runaway locomotive. The bounty hunter's sadistic grin vanished, immediately replaced by a look of profound, vacant shock. He stumbled backward, his revolvers firing uselessly into the ceiling rafters before he collapsed backward off the wooden porch, falling dead into the blood-stained, trampled snow. Clara dropped the rifle, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she rushed blindly toward Wyatt. The roaring fire in the center of the room had been mostly smothered by the rug, leaving only thick, choking smoke and the putrid smell of sulfur. Wyatt pushed himself up with a groan, wrapping his massive, powerful arms around Clara, pulling her tightly against his broad chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, breathing in the sweet scent of her, overwhelmed by the profound realization that this fragile, resilient woman had just saved his life. "You're safe," Wyatt whispered fiercely, kissing the crown of her head as the wind howled through the broken door. "It's over." Gunsmoke lingered heavily in the frigid air of the cabin, mixing sickeningly with the metallic scent of fresh blood and charred pine. Clara dropped to her knees beside Wyatt, her hands frantically checking his face and chest for any new wounds. The giant of a man simply pulled her closer, his massive hands trembling as they stroked her dark, disheveled hair. For a long time, the only sounds were the howling Colorado wind pouring through the shattered door and Toby's exhausted cries from behind the iron stove. The terrifying siege was over, but the grim reality of their situation was already beginning to settle like heavy frost over Wyatt's mind. "I killed him," Clara whispered, her voice hollow as she stared at the lifeless body of Jebediah Cross sprawled in the bloody snow on the porch. The sheer magnitude of taking a human life sent violent tremors down her spine. Wyatt cupped her face, forcing her tear-filled brown eyes to meet his piercing blue gaze. "You saved our family, Clara. You did what you had to do to survive. That man was a demon walking the earth, and he would have slaughtered us all without a second thought. Do not let his evil taint your soul." Despite the comfort in his gravelly voice, Wyatt knew that Jebediah's death brought only a temporary reprieve. Leaning heavily against Clara's shoulder, he managed to stand, his injured thigh screaming in protest. He limped out onto the porch, looking down at the massive bounty hunter, and then further down the trail where Gideon Rutledge's body lay half buried in a snowdrift. The Union Pacific Syndicate would not simply forget $5,000 in stolen gold, nor would they forgive the death of their most lethal tracker. "Nathaniel Reed won't stop," Wyatt stated grimly, bracing himself against the doorframe. "When Jebediah doesn't return, they will send someone worse. They'll send Charlie, Siringo, or one of the other Pinkerton boys who don't care about the cold. As long as Wyatt Mercer is alive, you and Toby will be hunted." Clara's heart plummeted. "Then we run. We take the mule, we take the remaining gold, and we ride further west. We can go to California or the Oregon Territory. A giant with a heavy limp, a beautiful woman, and a baby are easy to track," Wyatt replied, his eyes narrowing as a desperate, heartbreaking plan began to form in his mind. He looked back at the sturdy log cabin. He had built this home with his own 2 hands. It held the ghosts of his past, the memories of a wife and son he had buried in the unforgiving earth. But looking at Clara, fiercely brave and desperately loving, he knew it was time to let the ghosts go. "They need to find a dead man, Clara," Wyatt said softly. He pointed to the towering corpse of Jebediah Cross. The bounty hunter was a large man, broad and tall enough to pass for Wyatt if the body were burned beyond recognition. It was a gruesome, morbid task, but it was their only chance at true freedom. Working together through the freezing night, they executed a plan of absolute finality. Wyatt stripped his legendary grizzly bear coat, the garment that made him a recognizable myth in the San Juan Mountains, and draped it over Jebediah's body inside the cabin. He took a handful of the minted gold eagles, the ones bearing the specific scratches the syndicate would be looking for, and scattered them across the floorboards near the bounty hunter's outstretched hand. He even left his prized Colt revolver, the barrel bent and useless from the wolf attack, lying in the ashes of the hearth. Clara gathered only the essentials, the heavy quilts, a few cooking tins, dried meat, and the remaining pouches of stolen gold. She bundled Toby securely in a thick woolen sling against her chest, whispering soft reassurances to the sleeping infant. When the pack mule and the black draft horse were fully loaded and led a safe distance down the trail, Wyatt stood before the open doorway of his home. He struck a match against a rough stone. He didn't look back at the hollowed floorboard where he had kept the daguerreotype of his first wife. That picture was safely tucked inside his shirt pocket. He was not erasing his past. He was simply refusing to let it destroy his future. He tossed the match into a pool of kerosene he had poured over the wooden dining table. Flames erupted instantly, catching the dry pine logs with a ravenous hunger. Wyatt stepped back into the snow, wrapping his arm around Clara's waist. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the fire consume the cabin, sending a massive pillar of black smoke up into the starry winter sky. It would be a beacon for anyone in Oakhaven, a clear sign of a tragic, deadly blaze. "Goodbye, Wyatt Mercer," Clara murmured softly, leaning her head against his chest. "Wyatt Mercer died in that fire," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He kissed the top of her head. "But William Miller is heading west with his wife and son. Let's go home, Clara." Their descent from the timberline was grueling, but the harsh winter was finally beginning to break. By the time they reached the lower valleys a week later, the snow was melting into rushing streams, and the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the muddy earth. They bypassed Oakhaven entirely, riding straight for a small railway station miles away from the syndicate's influence. Using their new names, they purchased passage on a train bound for the lush, untamed valleys of Oregon. Clara sat by the window, the beautiful, scarred giant resting his head upon her shoulder, while baby Toby slept peacefully on his lap. They had survived the cruelty of the mountains, leaving a legend behind in the ashes, to forge a quiet, beautiful reality of their own. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the brutal, beautiful frontier of the Old West. Clara and Wyatt's story proves that even in the darkest, coldest moments of our lives, the human spirit can forge unbreakable bonds and fight for a brighter tomorrow. If you enjoyed this thrilling tale of survival, redemption, and untamed romance, please hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with your friends and family who love historical drama, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss out on our upcoming frontier adventures.